And I'd like to now bring up another interesting place that you're finding descendants of the Israelites. And in America today, you see a very large movement of African Americans who say that they're the real chosen people, that they're the children of Israel, they're the Judeans. So what are they just trying to create an identity for themselves because they were slaves, or is there really something here? And the answer is, most likely there is something there. And most likely, maybe that they were the original Israelites, and maybe that the Jewish people today who are white, Caucasian people came in a little bit later on. We know they were sold into slavery. We know now that they're fulfilling prophecies by saying, we're coming back, we want to rejoin the nation. We know that some of the greatest sages of the transmission of the Torah were converts from Rome. You have a man named Onkelos who wrote a commentary on the Torah, unprecedented, that we still learn today. He was a convert. Some of the largest pillars on the transmission today were Roman converts. So here we are, we're Caucasian Jewish people. And
all right. Right now I'm in the Jewish Almanac from 1980. All right, this is the cover right here. It says a celebration of Jewish life and the Jewish people, a fact-filled book. All right, again, a fact-filled book of information and entertainment. All right, traditions, history, religion, wisdom, and achievements. Again, the Jewish Almanac. All right, and we go right to part 1 of this Almanac magazine, Jewish Almanac, and it says part 1, identity crisis. It says a brief history of the terms for Jew. All right, we're gonna get into that. All right, so I'm zoomed in now. All right, so you can see it clearly, and it says here, strictly speaking, it is incorrect to call an ancient Israelite a Jew. All right, again, strictly speaking, it is incorrect to call an ancient Israelite a Jew, or to call a contemporary Jew an Israelite. All right, so you can't say that the ancient Israelites are the same as Jews. All right, that's incorrect. And you can't say that modern Jews or contemporary Jews are Israelite or a Hebrew. You can't say they're Hebrew contemporary Jews. All right, again, we're in the Jewish Almanac of 1980. So you can't, just because somebody's called a Jew, basically what they're saying, that doesn't mean, that's incorrect to think that they're talking about an Israelite or a Hebrew. The first Hebrews may not have been Jews at all. Again, the first Hebrews, remember, Hebrews may not have been Jews at all. All right, so we're in Online Etymology Dictionary. All right, and we got the word Hebrew here. Just wanted to go ahead and read this before we continue. So what is Hebrew? It says here an adjective, right? It says late Old English, from Old French Hebrew, from Latin Hebraeus, from Greek Hebraios, and Aramaic Semitic Hebrai, corresponding to Hebrew Ibri and Israelite, in quotes. Traditionally from an ancestral name Eber. All right, so they get it from Eber, but probably literally, all right, but most likely literally one from the other side. One from the other side. So if you're in Africa or you're in Europe and you want to reference an American, you're going to say, well, he's one from the other side, right? He's on the other side of the ocean. Perhaps in reference to the river Euphrates. Is this the real ancient Atlantic Ocean? Was it just a river? Was it a huge river? So perhaps simply signifying immigrant. All right, so look at what it all means. It says Eber also means region on the other or opposite side. All right, a region on the opposite side. So wouldn't America be on the opposite side of Europe, Asia, and Africa? All right, America is on the opposite side. See, Hebrew? Are you a Hebrew? Well, if you're on the opposite side of Africa and Europe, meaning if you're in America, yeah, you could use Hebrew as an adjective. All right, so we're trying to break this down, not trying to say this is a religion or anything, just trying to show the etymology, because it means something, right? It doesn't just mean a religion or something like that, right? So it's a very general term, actually, as you can see, but it means something specifically to somebody being separated, all right? Being separated or unreachable to certain people, all right? On another side. All right, so the first Hebrews may not have been Jews at all. All right, so we're back in the Jewish almanac. All right, now listen to what it says here. It says now Hebrew. All right, again, we just got the etymology online. Now they're gonna break it down, right? In this almanac, it says Hebrew. The word Hebrew or Ibri, right? We got that occurs in the early narratives of the Pentateuch to refer to an Israelite. All right, so remember what it meant. So an Israelite, when they were saying Hebrew or Ibri, they were saying, yo, he's a migrant. Yo, oh, he's one from the other side. Oh, he's from the region from the other side. So that person's from the other side. When they were referring an Israelite to a Hebrew, meaning this person was one from the other side. And migrant of Eber, we got also Eber, feather, of the feathers, of the people who wear feathers. But only in those narratives, such as the Joseph story in Genesis 39:48 and the Exodus story, Exodus 3:10, that are set in Egypt, where Israelites are regarded as foreigners. All right, foreigners, ones from another side. Who was calling them Hebrew? All right, and who was the real Egyptians? We're still talking about American to marry the mound builders and all that, Little Egypt. It doesn't matter if it was people that were here still. Yeah, not everybody was from the same nation, but we were all here. This is the ancient land. This is the biblical lands up over here. All right, so it says they were foreigners there. All right, so they would be called somebody from another side, right, or another region, because they're foreigners from that land. So an Egyptian would call them an Ibri, a migrant, or somebody from the other side, a Hebrew. It says there, Hebrew is either used by Egyptians to refer to Israelites or by Israelites to refer to themselves in the presence of Egyptians among themselves. The preferred term is Bene Yisrael, children of Israel, or Israelites. Another way could be Yasharallah, right? A similar usage of Hebrew is found in the stories of the interaction between Israelites and Philistines in 1 Samuel, and the interaction of Abraham with Canaanites and other non-Israelites in Genesis 14, where the Greek translator renders the term Ivri by a word meaning man of the Jonder region. You see, they're breaking it down again. Ivri, Hebrew Ibri, a man from a Jonder region, from another region, a man from the opposite side, somebody who's not from this land, all right, a man from Jonder region. Jonah, likewise, at sea with a crew of non-Israelites, refers to himself in the presence as a Hebrew, because he's saying, yo, I'm just a man from the Jonder region. You don't know me. I'm from over there, Maraka. All right, remember Jonah was in the ocean traveling. So since the term Ivri or Ivri is possibly based on the common preposition iver, meaning across, beyond, Jonder, the suffix is an adjectival, and then called a gentilic, with the sense of it. The meaning of the term could have the general sense of Jonderite. Oh, Israelite Jonderite. Example for foreigner. But since a number of regions in the Middle East are designated by the term Iver or Iverhan Yarden, Transjordan, Iverhan Nahar, Transriverine, example, Trans-Euphrates, the term Ivri could just as well designate a dweller of one of these familiar neighboring trans regions, right? But see, now he's trying to relate it to there, but it doesn't. He's trying to relate it because they have to try, because it doesn't. Because they're talking about, like I said earlier, if these Israelites or Hebrews who are being really what it means as people who are from a distant or opposite land, they wouldn't be from around these regions, right, of the Middle East. So he's letting you know straight up. He's trying to explain it in there, even though it don't make sense, that they could be, from these also closer regions. All right, but the truth is, there is no Middle East. That's Africa or West Asia, and biblical lands, promised land, Canaan is right here. Amaraka, Canaan land. What do you mean? Canada? What are you talking about, man? All right, so we're almost done with this. It says, merely regional particularity, confusion on the matter is compounded by the additional ambiguity in the frame of reference in which the designation Hebrew originated, where the Hebrews thought of as those out yonder from the standpoint of Mesopotamians, or those from out yonder from the standpoint of Canaanites. You hear that? Let me explain what he just said there, what they just said in the Jewish Almanac of 1980. All right, just what I said before. You're getting a descriptive term, an adjective, right, for a people, from people who don't really, live with them always, or part of their nations or family. So like he's saying, so that's probably a term that the Mesopotamians or the Canaanites were using to call these people Hebrews, meaning those from out yonder, those from the opposite side, one from the other side, a migrant. All right, of the feathers, people of the feathers. Eber means pinion. Go look at Strong's dictionary for Eber. It goes down to pinion, and pinion means feather. All right. So again, the Jewish Almanac of 1980. All right, letting you know that strictly speaking, it is incorrect to call an ancient Israelite a Jew, or to call a contemporary Jew an Israelite or a Hebrew. All right, the first Hebrews may not have been Jews at all. All right, just one more part. So further down it says the Hebrew alphabet was first disseminated by the Canaanite people known as the Phoenicians. All right, you saw my more videos. Canaanites descend from Ham. These are all Phoenicians. We know that Drew Ali said, the ancient Canaanites and Moabites are the Moors. So they would speak a form of Paleo, what they call Paleo Hebrew, and they also called Phoenicians. So it's telling you the Jewish Almanac right here says the Canaanite people known as the Phoenicians, a group closely related to Israelites linguistically, though not culturally or religiously. All right, not all kinfolk are kingfolk. All right, not culturally or religiously, but just linguistically. The particular form of the Hebrew alphabet used today is actually Syrian or Aramaic in origin. All right, so the one they use today is not really this Paleo Hebrew. All right, which you find in America today. You find it a lot in America. You found it in the mounds, and you got it in the Luna stone in New Mexico. All right. Now it says Israelite, like Hebrew, right, in parentheses, became common synonym for Jew. It became a synonym for Jew. It wasn't always. Remember in the beginning it told us it's not the same. Throughout post-biblical history down to modern times, with perhaps less adaptability to pejorative usage than the other terms. Since the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, the term has come to jostle against the newer term Israelite, all right, which is not synonymous in general. Israelite, all right, it's not synonymous. Israeli and Israelite, because Israelite means a biblical follower of the religion of Moses and descendant of Jacob. So it's not just a biblical follower, but more, biblically it's more like the descendants of Jacob, right? The tribes, the 12 tribes in Israelite, right? Israel, they named Jacob Israel. It was a title, Yasharallah, right? It says Israeli means a citizen of the state of Israel. It has nothing to do with Israelites or Hebrews. In Israeli, the term just means you're a citizen of the state of Israel over there in the Middle East, whether Jewish in region or not, though. Whether you're Jewish in region or not, though. All right. Of course, most Israelites are Jewish. All right. Israel, it says. So I just wanted to break this down a little bit. As you can see, you gotta be careful because they're letting you know straight up in their own words, right? That's two people already. We had the rabbi before say that, hey, the Americans, they're saying they're the original Hebrews, and he said, I think they are, So he knows something, obviously. This is from 1980. That video was way after this. So, he studied, and they let you know it doesn't mean the same. It doesn't mean that you are an actual Hebrew just because you're called a Jew. All right? Jewish Almanac, 1980.
Hello, this is Pastor Stephen Anderson from Faithful Word Baptist Church in Tempe, Arizona. Today I want to talk about Genesis chapter 10, verses 2 through 5, where the Bible reads, the sons of Japheth, Gomer and Magog and Madai and Javan and Tubal and Meshach and Tiras, and the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz and Riphath and Togarmah, and the sons of Javan, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their families, in their nations. Now, the reason that I read those scriptures to you is that they clearly state that Ashkenaz is one of the Gentile nations. Now, 80 to 85% of today's so-called Jewry, those who claim to be Jews in the world today, 80 to 85% of them are what is known as Ashkenazi Jews. And an Ashkenazi Jew is so named because he primarily descends from this guy in the Bible named Ashkenaz, which is clearly listed as one of the Gentile nations. Now, the reason for this is that there was a nation of people who were of Japheth, who were Europeans, white people, known as the Khazars. And in the 8th century after Christ, the whole nation of the Khazars turned unto Judaism. They converted to the religion of Judaism. And for a few hundred years, the empire of the Khazars was a power in Eastern Europe, and they followed the religion of Judaism. But eventually they were defeated by the Russians, and they were scattered into Eastern Europe. And so a lot of the Eastern European Jews today are the descendants of the Khazars. And in fact, DNA testing has even confirmed that the Ashkenazi Jews have about 80% of their genetics and 80% of their ancestry from Europeans. So today's so-called Jews, the Ashkenazis, which again, like I said, is 80 to 85% of so-called Jews in the world today, and it is the primary type of Jew that immigrated into the nation of Israel and Palestine. And it is also the primary type of Jew that is living in the United States today, by far. So these Ashkenazi Jews, according to the Bible, are actually Gentiles. And I'm not the one calling them Ashkenazi Jews. They'll even call themselves Ashkenazi Jews. You could even just go to Wikipedia and just type in Ashkenazi Jews, and it will explain these things to you. You can talk to a rabbi, and you can talk to whoever you want, and you'll find out that these Ashkenazi Jews are the descendants of converts. A lot of Christian Zionists today, they claim that these Jews are God's chosen people because of the fact that they descend from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But in reality, they don't descend from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob any more than you or I do. Okay? They have some blood mixed in from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob from intermarrying with other Jews, but so do the rest of us Europeans. Primarily, they are white Europeans. They are not Middle Eastern Jews. And that's why when you look at those in Hollywood today that are so-called Jews, they don't look like Middle Eastern people. They look like white people because they are the descendants of white converts to Judaism, Caucasian converts, Khazars. That's why they're called Ashkenazi, because they're of Japheth. They're primarily descended from the Gentiles.
So we just got the pastor. He was letting us know that that they descend from Ashkenaz, who's from Japheth, right? These Khazars, right? So we're gonna learn a little bit about the Ashkenazi, or at least what we can find, all right, here. But we're gonna read some other things later on. But it says here in this website, it's called thescientist.com, exploring life, inspiring innovation. And it says here, genetic roots of the Ashkenazi Jews. Most Ashkenazi Jews, traditionally believed to have descended from the ancient tribes of Israel, may in fact be maternally descended from prehistoric Europeans. All right, they're actually Europeans. The majority of Ashkenazi Jews are descended from the prehistoric European women, according to a study published Tuesday, October 8th in Nature Communications. While the Jewish religion began in the Near East and the Ashkenazi Jews were believed to have origins in the early indigenous tribes of this region, new evidence from mitochondrial DNA, which is passed on exclusively from mother to child, suggests that female ancestors of most modern Ashkenazi Jews converted to Judaism in the North Mediterranean around 2,000 years ago, and later in West and Central Europe. All right, again, what? Converted. So that first rabbi we heard, he's letting us know these Romans, that these famous sages that actually taught the Torah, these very famous ancient sages that was teaching the Torah, were actually converted Romans to these first converted Jews, right? They were actually converted too, Romans. All right, where this other website says Frontiers in Genetics, the Origins of Ashkenazi Jews and Jiddish. All right, and right here it says historical meaning of Ashkenaz. Says Ashkenaz is one of the most disputed biblical place names. It appears in the Hebrew Bible as the name of one of Noah's descendants. All right, that's what the guy was talking about earlier through Japhet, right? One of his sons. As a reference to the kingdom of Ashkenaz, prophesied to be called together with Ararat and Minai to wage war against Babylon. Jeremiah 51:27, in addition to tracing Ashkenazi Jews to the ancient Iranian lands of Ashkenaz and uncovering the villages whose names may derive from Ashkenaz, the partial Iranian origin of Ashkenazi Jews inferred by Das et al. In 2006 was further supported by genetic similarity of Ashkenazi Jews to Sephardic Mountain Jews and Iranian Jews, as well as their similarity to Near Eastern populations and simulated native Turkish and Caucasus populations, the Khazars, right? There are good grounds, therefore, for inferring that Jews who consider themselves Ashkenazic adopted this name and spoke of their lands as Ashkenaz, since they perceived themselves as Iranian origin, that we find varied evidence of the knowledge of Iranian language among Moroccan and Andalusian Jews and Karaites. You hear this? It's a big confederacy here. Andalusians? What are you talking about? Huh? Thought that was a Moorish town. Alright? Karaites? And to the 11th century's compelling point of reference to assess the shared Iranian origins of Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews. Moreover, Iranian-speaking Jews in the Caucasus, the so-called Juhudis, and Turkic-speaking Jews in the Crimea prior to World War II called themselves Ashkenazism. Nazism. The Rhineland hypothesis cannot explain why a name that denotes Scythians and was associated with the Near East becomes associated with German lands in the 11th to 13th century. Uproot suggested that Jewish immigrants in Europe transferred biblical names onto the regions in which they settled. This is unconvincing. Biblical names were used as place names only when they had similar sound. Not only Germany and Ashkenaz do not share similar sounds, but Germany was already named Germana or Germanja in the Iranian Babylonian Talmud, completed in the 5th century AD, and not surprisingly was associated with Noah's grandson Gomer. Talmud Joma, alright? Noah's grandson Gomer from Gomer, alright, you hear this? That's Japhet again. Alright, Talmud Joma. Continues as the genetic structure of Ashkenazic Jews. Ashkenazi Jews were localized to modern-day Turkey and found to be genetically closest to Turkic, Southern Caucasian, and Iranian populations, suggesting a common origin in Iranian Ashkenaz lands, descendants of Ashkenaz in the lands of Ashkenaz. These findings were more compatible with an Irano-Turco-Slavic origin for Ashkenazi Jews and a Slavic origin for Jiddish than with the Rhineland hypothesis. So this is the original. They say, oh, we were just German. You know, that's what it means. Ashkenaz means German. All right, but actually it's Turkic and, Caucasian, and, it has a lot of Slavic relations as well. All those areas up there in between, almost getting to the Middle East, but actually in Europe still. Eastern Europe, they call. The findings have also highlighted the strong social, cultural, and genetic bonds of Ashkenazic and Iranian Judaism and their shared Iranian origins. All right, so now I'm in myjewishlearning.com. It says, who are the Ashkenazi Jews? All right, now it's important what we just read. You know how they're trying to say the Reinhardt hypothesis means that they just came from Germany and that's it. They had no relation to Iranians or Turkish people or Caucasian people, none of that, right? Because they, they want to be linked to ancient Hebrew. So going with the whole Turkic and Iranian thing, it doesn't link them to that. So here it says Ashkenazi Jews are the Jewish ethnic identity most readily recognized by North Americans. All right, so most of the Jews in North America are what? Ashkenazi Jews. The culture of matzah balls, black-hatted Hasidim in Jiddish, the ethnicity originated in medieval Germany. Although strictly speaking, all right, so now this is what the story goes, right, that originated in Germany, but we just debunked that, right, through genetics. We just saw the two other websites, right? Although strictly speaking, Ashkenazism refers to Jews of Germany, the term has come to refer more broadly Jews from Central and Eastern Europe. All right, it has come. They're learning. There's new information coming out. You can't control the information. All right, genetics is telling people, and there's more information to tell you that it's actually more broadly to Jews from Central and Eastern Europe. Jews first reached the interior of Europe by following trade routes along waterways during the 8th and 9th centuries. Eventually, the vast majority of Ashkenazi Jews relocated to the Polish Commonwealth, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Ukraine, and Belarus. All right, we got that already too, where princes welcomed their skilled and educated workforce. The small pre-existing Polish Jewish communities' customs were displaced by the Ashkenazic prayer, order, customs, and Yiddish language. All right. We're in the Encyclopedia Britannica. We're telling us that the Ashkenazi people, says today, Ashkenazism constitute more than 80% of all Jews in the world. All right. Now remember, well, they told us in the almanac that just because you're a Jew doesn't mean you're an ancient Israelite. It's not synonymous. All right. Remember that. Vastly outnumbered Sephardic Jews. In the early 21st century, Ashkenazic Jews numbered about 11 million. In Israel, the numbers of Ashkenazism and Sephardim are roughly equal, and the chief rabbinate has both as Ashkenazic and a Sephardic chief rabbi on equal footing. All Reform and conservative Jewish congregations belong to the Ashkenazic tradition. All right.
But your grandfather was the founding, one of the founding fathers of the State of Israel?
Yes, he was.
Tell us about this.
Yes, he was. The generation of my grandparents was the generation of the first Jews to take on Zionism as an ideology and take on this idea of establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And he was very active. He became a leader within the movement. He was a member of the de facto Jewish government before the State of Israel was established. And he was one of the signers on the Declaration of Independence when the State of Israel was established.
Okay, and then from there, your father actually, he was the general.
My father was, yes, both my parents were born in Palestine, so they're the first generation Israelis, if you will, first generation Jews who were born there. And my father, as a young man, while still in high school, joined the Zionist militia. He became an officer, so in the War of 1948, when the Zionists occupied most of Palestine, he was an officer already. And then he remained in the military as a career officer, and by 1967 he was already a general and a member of the Israeli Central Command, the High Command.
Now something happened in your life, something very sad and tragic, that your niece, she was killed by a suicide bomber, is that right?
That's right. Well, my sister came out, when she came out and started talking to people and answering questions, because there was a lot of press, it was big news in Israel. In fact, it was big news everywhere, all over the world, because she was a granddaughter of a famous general. In terms of responsible, both she and her husband said, we hold the Israeli government responsible for our daughter's death, because when you maintain such a brutal oppression and a brutal occupation against another nation, when you take away people's land and you destroy their homes, when you incarcerate their fathers and quite often their mothers, when you shoot their brothers and sisters in their school, in the schoolyards, this is what we get. This is the price that you pay as a society that maintains such a brutal oppression and occupation against another people. There's a price to be paid, and this is the price that we pay, and therefore they both felt that they both held the Israeli government responsible, because the Israeli government is responsible for the reality that exists there.
Now someone just said that's an anti-Semitic statement you just made. Somebody's pointing the finger and say, this guy's anti-Semitic. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I'm Jewish, so being anti-Semitic is nonsense. Number one. Number two, being anti-Semitic means being racist against Jews. I'm not racist against Jews. But I am critical of the State of Israel. I'm critical of Zionism, which has really nothing to do with Jews, although they claim to. So there's nothing anti-Semitic about criticizing Israel. In fact, most Jews don't even live there. Most Jews never accepted Zionism, so I don't think that has anything to do with it. And it's a claim that's being thrown out when there's nothing else to say. when the other side, the pro-Israeli side, the side that supports the violence in Palestine, has nothing to say, they say anti-Semitic. Well, so they say anti-Semitic.
What if someone says, look, he's just a self-hating Jew? Have you heard this statement?
Yeah, well, I certainly don't hate myself, so that's nonsense. Yeah. And I don't hate anybody else. I think it's one of those things they throw at you when they've got no argument.
I just had a rabbi give me an analogy. He said, look, imagine you left your home and then someone came and occupied it, and then you try to get it back, and then they went to the judge. Have you heard some of these analogies? Maybe you can.
Yeah, that's assuming that, you know, that's taking it into a place which I don't usually go. That's making the assumption that today's Jews are really the descendants of the ancient Hebrews that used to live in that part of the world some 3,000 years ago. That's making the assumption that today's Jews are really the descendants of the ancient Hebrews that used to live in that part of the world some 3,000 years ago. That's a bit of a stretch for me. And even if it was true, I don't think it. I agree with him. It doesn't justify. You know, I did not live there 3,000 years ago. My grandparents immigrated from Ukraine. Their parents, their grandparents didn't live there, and I don't know any Jew that can trace his or her ancestors back to the ancient Hebrews. You know, I did not live there 3,000 years ago. My grandparents immigrated from Ukraine. Their parents, their grandparents didn't live there, and I don't know any Jew that can trace his or her ancestors back to the ancient Hebrews. So that's a lot of, you know, that's a lot of myth there, and I don't think it's relevant. So that's a lot of, you know, that's a lot of myth there, and I don't think it's relevant to the point.
All right, so just wanted to go ahead and come to this genealogical table of the descendants or generations of Japhet. I know a lot of you don't feel this Bible stuff, but we're just trying to make sense out of all these people, you know, so we don't just hear, oh, it's a mystery where they originate. It's a mystery. You don't even know where the Greeks and all these people originated, right? But try to make sense of who their ancestors are, right? And see if biblically we can make this historical. All right, so we were just talking about, well, we talked about the Ashkenazi Jews, right? Ashkenaz. We got the pastor mentioning them, and also we read about, you know, how most of the Eastern European Jews were Ashkenaz, right? So we know that Ashkenaz is actual person, all right? So, I mean, logically, like the pastor was saying, and everybody, and then the studies that they were saying, that, you know, must be like they're descendant from this dude Ashkenaz, who's actually son of Gomer and son of Japhet, so a grandson of Japhet, Ashkenaz. And it says here ancient names, Reginius, Ashkenazi, Sakai, and it says eventually Japanese. You see that? Eventually the Japanese. All right, because that's the hijack right there. But we got Togarma. We're gonna read about Togarma as well. All right, because we know they already related that the Ashkenaz or the Ashkenazi Jews, right, are more Eastern European related to Turks, and we know that Togarma is the descendant or ancestor, I mean, of the Turkomans or the Turks. All right, Togarma. All right, and these are all from Japhet, so they're related. These are from Japhet, Magog, and Gomer. All right, we even see Madai, Medes, the Little Russians, Ukrainians, or Ruthenians. We saw the commander's son, right, say that his dad came from Ukraine. They've been there. They're Ukrainians, and now you see that these Ukrainians are Japhet as well. All right, now this is just a reference. We're gonna go into all this in other videos, all right, that I'm gonna be doing. You know, we're gonna try to put it all together, but remember this presentation. I'll try to reference it again so we can get this going through our heads and try to link all these people up, all right, at least to a common region or person, you know, or specific tribes, you know, that we can say, well, these were, you know, distant cousins, right? Like, look, under Magog, we got the Scythians, the Tartars, the Huns. Remember that it told us that the Jews, the Eastern European Jews, the Ashkenazi, were actually more related to Huns than the ancient Israelites. All right, the Huns are from Japhet too. All right, under Magog. All right. All right. I'm in the Sondervan Pictorial Bible Dictionary by Merrill C. Tini. All right. This is the official one in the 60s. All right. We're going to go to page 76. Well, around page 76. Let me see. All right. So actually page 77 of this book. And it says Ashkenaz, right? Ashkenaz. Great grandson of Noah through Japhet and Gomer. All right. And this is the Bible verses. It says a tribe or nation mentioned once in Jeremiah 51:27, associated with the Ararat and Mini as an instrument of wrath in the hands of God against Babylon. They fought for the Most High, you know. And so again, a tribe or a nation, a nation. He has a nation, Ashkenaz. All right, he had a nation. Where's their descendants? All right, we're page, let's see, 402, and we're under Japhet now. All right. It says God will enlarge. That's what it means. It says a son of Noah. He was older than Shem, but comes third in some list of the three sons. Shem, however, is usually named first. Japhet and his wife were saved in the ark. He aided Shem in covering the naked body of their drunken father. He is the progenitor of the more remote northern peoples of southeastern Europe. All right, ancestor what? Of who? Southeastern Europe's, right? Ashkenazi Jews, these Khazars, all these Turks, right? Mongols, that he was to occupy the tents of Shem is thought to refer to conquest of the Greeks who were descendants of Japhet. All right, the Greeks are descendants of Japhet. All right, Greeks, you know the Greeks are black, right? We saw Medicine Man's video. The ancient Greeks were black. All right, so even Japhet was black. It wasn't always about white. All right, this he did during the days of Assyrian power. He had 7 sons whose descendants occupied the isles of the Gentiles, Hellenes or Greeks, an area including Asia Minor and Upper Greece. All right, that's Japhet right there. All right, you say it's only. All right, we're in this book now. Let me just zoom in. It says the Khazars in Annotated Bibliography by Bernard D. Wainwright. This is in Studies in Bibliography and Book Lore, Volume 11, number 1 and 2. All right, from the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. All right, and this is the article we're going to read. It says this by bibliography is based on the same principles as its predecessor, which appeared more than a decade ago. The annotations of the items are designed to indicate similar angles, such as the beginning and destruction of the Khazar state, eventual continuation after the 10th century conversion, problems of migration westward, and the origin of Eastern European Jewry. But this time the emphasis is also on several additional angles such as the visibility or lack of it in Jewish sources of the connection between the Khazars and Judaism or Jews. The application of the history of the Khazars today to today's political purposes and its combination with anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, or anti-Israeli tendencies. The first of these angles is already found in Josephus's genealogical table, 9th or 10th century, which depicts the Khazars as descendants of Togarma, a grandson of Noah's son Japhet. All right, so let's go back to that table we had earlier. All right, so Togarma, right? Togarma right here. All right, Togarma. The Khazars come out of this person, it says. Supposedly, the Khazars, Togarma, from Gomer, and Japhet. All right. Without mentioning that they, at least some of them, had any connection with Judaism. It is carried over into later centuries, for examples by 2 12th century Jewish travelers, Benjamin of Tudela and Petachia of Riesenberg. Bibliography, and as the number says, and Ishak Abramanel, commentary of Ezekiel, chapter 38, which by implication counts the Khazars among the people who will come with Gog to fight the Jews in the land of Israel and perish there. You see that? They will come with Gog. The Khazars, man, these Confederate. Who's the Khazars? See why they ain't mentioning the Khazars or want to be connected to these Khazars? All right. Among the people who will come with Gog to fight the Jews in the land of Israel and perish there. This, written in 1493, indicates that he regards the Khazars as anti-Jewish Gentiles. And then right here got a couple of sources. It says here by Marcus Nathan Adler, the itinerary of Benjamin of Tudela says the southern provinces of Russia were spoken of as the land of the Khazars, especially by Jewish writers long after the Russian conquest about the year 1000, and the Crimea was known to European travelers as Kasaria. All right. On this side it says Naji Aluj Al-Masira ila Palestine, says the journey to Palestine, 1964. It says there were 10 million Jewish Khazars. Thus, the Jews of Eastern Europe, who were the most Zionistic, did not originate in the kingdom of Judah and were not Semites. It says here by Menachem Amelander, Ben Solomon Halevi. All right, it says first edition Yiddish Amsterdam, 1741. Then it says new edition translation into Hebrew by Haim Homer Jerusalem in 1964. I remember the quoting sources here. It says Jehuda Halevi translated the Sefer HaKusari from the Khazar language. According to Arab authors, Khazar or Khazar, right, was the son of Japhet, or a descendant of Japhet, the son of Noah. Khazar separated from his brothers after they left the ark, and he came to the river Volga, building a large city there, which he called Al-Khazar. These people who lived on the north side of the Caspian Sea are also called Khazars, since they joined the Khazar nation. At first, the Khazar king leaned toward the Karaite form of Judaism until Rabbi Judah al-Nagari explained to him that this is not the real Judaism. He then converted to traditional Judaism, and according to the teachings of our rabbis, over 100,000 people converted to Judaism. You see that? They converts. All right. All right, we got another source here. It says Baratz GM Dreineshiv Eritsko Kasaro Ruski. All right, he got a very long name. All right, the oldest Jewish Khazar Russian legal monument, the legal code for people. In Sobrani Trudovpo Bopruso. All right, that's Russian. All right, right there again. It says collected works on the problem of the Jewish element in the monuments of Old Russian literature, Volume 1. This is from 1927, and it says, insofar as the Slavic nations, especially the Bulgars, were influenced by the Old Testament, it was through the Jewish Khazars. All right, Slavic nations, Jewish Khazars, the converts. The original legal code, which was enforced in Khazaria, consisted of the religio-civil code designed for the populace. All right, another source here says Julian Bartosewicz, Studia Historicini y Literati, or Historical and Literary Studies, Volume 2, from 1881. All right, it says the Khazars were a people related to the Huns. All right, the Huns. The Khazar state was multi-tribal, speaking a language which resembled that of the Volga Bulgars. The religion of the top rulers was Judaism, to which they changed from Islam. From what? From Islam. From what? From Islam. All right, you see the relation? You see where the relation's going, right? Confederate, you see what's going on here, right? We're going to get deeper into this as the videos go. All right? All right, got another source here. It says Bashmakov, or Une solution nouvelle de problème des Khazars, Mercury de France. All right, pages 39 and 73 says the Khazars' racial origin and the geographic position of their capital seems to confirm the information given in King Joseph's letter. Got to get into that. It says here John O. Betty, The Iron Curtain Over America, Dallas, 1951, chapters 3 and 4, Russia and the Khazars joined the Democratic Party. It says the author maintains that communism is the creation of Judaized Khazars in Russia. The Marxian program of drastic controls, so repugnant to the free Western mind, was no obstacle to the acceptance by many Khazar Jews, for the Babylonian Talmud, under which they lived, had taught them to accept authoritarian dictation on everything from their immorality to their trade practices. He also states that persons of Khazar background or tradition, or of related origin or ideology, are in high positions and influence in the American Democratic Party and the United States government, and that they play leading roles in England and France. All right, it says here from Ishak Ben Sevi. All right, so from Tel Aviv from 1951. It says Jews came very early to the Crimea, where they organized agriculture and urban settlements and took over the commerce between the Slavs and the Khazars, upon both of whom they exerted some influence. But it was mainly the Persian Jews, again, who was these Persian Jews, who influenced the Khazar king, Bulan, and his top officials to convert to Judaism. in 732 or 740. The military and civilian elite were the first to become Jews, and later others followed in their footsteps. In the 9th and the beginning of the 10th century, when the Khazars conquered the Crimea, the local Crimean Jews integrated into Khazar Jewry. At the beginning of the 11th century, the Khazar state was definitely defeated by the Russian princes, losing its oldest center on the River Don, but continuing to rule in Dagestan, northern Caucasus, and the Crimea. It has now become clear that something of the Jewish Khazar state existed up to the 13th century until the Mongol invasion. So-called Mongol, who's this? These hordes. The hordes, which is the Russian armies. Talking about Georgi, Genghis, aka Genghis. Okay, we got another source here. It says from Jivo Blätter 13 from 1938, pages 109 to 23. It says the native Crimean Jews, the Krimchaki and the Karaites, have different blood types than the Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews. All right, they're different. You see, the Karaites, they ain't the same as these Ashkenazi, because we're learning about the Karaites and Prester John, right? All right, but they have a different blood type than the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic Jews. Their blood structure is close to that of the pure Turkic tribes from Japhet, right? And the Kyrgyz and the Uzbeks. This blood composition may possibly be connected with the Khazar origin. All right, we got another source here from Mohammed Isat Darwaza. Says Tariq Bani Israeli min Asfarim, the history of the children of Israel from their books, volume 3, Cairo 1960. It says the Khazars were the largest group to convert to Judaism, and they are known as Ashkenazism. What? The Khazars are known as Ashkenazism? They converted to Judaism? Another source here says Max Diamant and Arthur Praise, Diasharin, Adu, oh, I can't read that. All right, and this is from the Judische Volkskunst by Max Diamant in 1937. It says, before the immigration of Jews from Germany, remnants of the Khazars who had converted to Judaism in their Asiatic abodes came to Poland. So before they got to Poland or Germany, all right, Jews from Germany, right? They didn't originate there. They didn't just go from the Holy Land to Germany. All right, these were Khazars who converted to Judaism, all right, before they got there to Poland. Traces of their culture can be found in the Jewish art of Eastern Europe. All right, so I just wanted to show you some examples because actually, you know, this keeps going. There's actually a lot of references. You know, I can keep going to the next pages. You know, and it'll keep it'll keep going, giving me references. That's what this article is about, this scholarly article, right? So we can go all day talking about the Khazars, but I just want to continue with the video. I just wanted you to get a clear understanding that this is a historical people, historical empire, and they didn't just vanish, all right? They didn't just vanish like they tell us, all right? All right, so just one quick source so you can see, you know, I'm just picking them at random. Here, I'm gonna go zoom into this one. Hold on, let me just go a little bit more in. All right, and it starts right here. In the bottom, it says it's from Julil Jasen, Historia Evrekrikosko Narodo Rossi, the history of the Jewish people in Russia, volume 1. All right, and it goes right here. It says the Khazars came from Asia into South Russian steppe, where they formed a number of urban settlements. In the 8th century, the Khazar king Kagan and his entourage embraced the Jewish religion. They embraced it, they converted. During the same century, they overpowered the Eastern Slavic tribes. A century later, they spread their rule over the whole territory between northern Caucasus and the Kiev region. By 964 or thereabouts, the Kiev prince defeated the Khazars, who soon disappeared. See, like I told you, they say they disappeared, but they actually went to Poland. There's a lot of different investigations, all right, that they actually settled in Poland. All right, like it says over here on this side, look, I didn't even read this. Like Jewish settlements in Poland and Russia, all right? So they were around for about 300, 400 years. That's not a little bit, that was a lot. That was a big empire. They were controlling the trade and all that between Europe and Asia, all right? These Khazars. All right, so now we're in this book. It's called The 13th Tribe, The Khazar Empire and Its Heritage by Arthur Koestler, all right? Now it says, this book traces the history of the ancient Khazar Empire, a major but almost forgotten power in Eastern Europe, which in the Dark Ages became converted to Judaism. Khazaria was finally wiped out by the forces of Genghis Khan. but evidence indicates that the Khazars themselves migrated to Poland and formed the cradle of Western Jewry. So again, now we're seeing, so if these, now we heard that, they're not the Hebrews from the ancient, times, from different sources already, right? He even got, the son of a, one of the founding fathers of Israel, letting you know straight up, they're not the same people that lived there 3,000 years ago, even though it wasn't there. But anyways, they're letting us know in this book that there was a empire which was called the Khazar Empire. All right, a major but almost forgotten power in Eastern Europe, and it says that these people were not wiped out completely by Genghis Khan and these so-called Mongols. We're talking about Genghis Khan. Is this really Georgy Danilovich, the original Russians? This is Judov. All right. So either way, they're saying that these Khazars were not wiped out completely. They actually migrated to Poland and formed the cradle of Western Jewry. And the first rabbi we heard, he's letting you know, hey man, these are Caucasian people. We're Caucasian people. And then the second preacher, the guy, the pastor, he's letting you know, these are white people. These are 80% European DNA. All right, these Khazars. All right, they're not even, he told us Ashkenazi, right? So this correlating with this book also. So it says the Khazar sway extended from the Black Sea to the Caspian, from the Caucasus to the Volga, and they were instrumental in stopping the Muslim onslaught against Byzantium, the eastern jaw of the gigantic pincer movement that in the west swept across northern Africa and into Spain. So they were actually helping Europe not get invaded that much by Muslims or Arabs, because they were kind of in the way. To get to from Asia to Europe, you have to go through the Caucasus if you don't want to go through Africa and the Mediterranean. So yeah, they were holding that down and they weren't letting nobody go by there. So they were kind of helping. They had an important role. All right. In the second part of this book, The Heritage, Mr. Koestler speculates about the ultimate fate of the Khazars and their impact on the racial composition and social heritage of modern Jewry. He produces a large body of meticulously detailed research in support of a theory that sounds all the more convincing for the restraint with which it is advanced. Yet, should this theory be confirmed, the term anti-Semitism would become void of meaning, since, as Mr. Koestler writes, it is based on a misapprehension shared by both the killers and their victims. The story of the Khazar Empire, as it slowly emerges from the past, begins to look like the most cruel hoax which history has ever perpetrated. All right, see how deep they're getting? Who are these Khazars today? Part 1, Rise and Fall of the Khazars. Says here, about the time when Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the West, the eastern confines of Europe, between the Caucasus and the Volga, were ruled by a Jewish state known as the Khazar Empire. Alright, so by the time of Charlemagne, this famous king, there was already a Jewish state known openly by everyone. The Khazar Empire was a Jewish state. Alright, during the time of Charlemagne. At the peak of its power from the 7th to the 10th centuries AD, it played a significant part in shaping the destinies of medieval and consequently of modern Europe. Alright, an important part. This Khazar Empire in modern Europe are a very important part in medieval and modern Europe. The Byzantine emperor and historian Constantine Porphyrogenitus must have been well aware of this when he recorded in his treatise on court protocol that letters addressed to the Pope in Rome, and similarly those to Emperor of the West, had a gold seal worth 2 solidi attached to them, whereas messages to the king of the Khazars displayed a seal worth 3 solidi. It had more worth, they're saying. This was not flattery, but realpolitik. In the period with which we are concerned, wrote Bury, it is probable that the Khan of the Khazars was a little less importance in view of the imperial foreign policy than Charles the Great and his successors. All right, so he had a very important role. He was respected just like Charles the Great. A few years later, probably AD 740, the king, his court, and the military ruling class embraced the Jewish faith. All right, this is it right here. How did they become Jews then in Hebrews? Kurimeo says that in the year 740, the Khazar Empire, the king, right, his court, the military ruling class, they all embraced the Jewish faith, and Judaism became the state religion of the Khazars. It wasn't a heritage for them. It wasn't a race. It wasn't a people, a nation. It was a religion, and it became the official faith. It became the state religion of the Khazars. They adopted it as a religion. No doubt their contemporaries were as astonished by this decision as modern scholars were when they came across the evidence in the Arab, Byzantine, Russian, and Hebrew sources. You understand? Modern scholars know this is a fact. It's in the Arab sources, right? The Byzantine sources, the Russian sources, and Hebrew sources. All right, classical antique sources. One of the most recent comments is to be found in a work by the Hungarian Marxist historian Dr. Antal Barta. His book on the Magyar society in the 8th and 9th centuries has several chapters on the Khazars, as during most of that period the Hungarians were ruled by them. Yet their conversion to Judaism is discussed in a single paragraph. With our investigations cannot go into problems pertaining to the history of ideas, but we must call the reader's attention to the matter of the Khazar kingdom's state religion. It was the Jewish faith which became the official religion of the ruling strata of society. It became, needless to say, the acceptance of the Jewish faith as the state religion of an ethnically non-Jewish people or non-Hebrew people. Non-Hebrew, they're not the Hebrews, could be the subject of interesting speculations. We shall, however, confine ourselves to the remark that this official conversion is defiance of Christian proselytizing by Byzantium, the Muslim influence from the East, and in spite of the political pressure of these two powers, to a religion which had no support from any political power, but was persecuted by nearly all, has come as a surprise to all historians concerned with the Khazars, and cannot be considered as accidental, but must be regarded as a sign of the independent policy pursued by that kingdom. All right, so they weren't influenced by anybody. We got before that the Persians were the ones who taught them this, Hebrew religion, and they adopted it from the Persians. Who were these Persians? Were these actually ancient Mayas or people from America? There's a lot of correlation to Persian culture and similarities that they found here when they went into Mesoamerica and they went to South America. So we're correlating all that. Where's the true old, the true old world is here, but where were these ancient lands really? Like we've been ancient Persia, ancient Babylon, all right? That a lot of those people really come from out of America, and a lot of those tales really happen in America. All right, so these people bring that influence over here to these people, to the Khazars from the Caucasus Mountains. All right, continues, says, which leaves us only slightly more bewildered than before. Yet whereas the sources differ in minor detail, the major facts are beyond dispute. All right, so there's a fact. It's a fact that they converted. That's what he's saying. What is in dispute, though, what is they're disputing, though, is the fate of the Jewish Khazars. What happened to these so-called Jewish Khazars after the destruction of their empire in the 12th or 13th century? On this problem, the sources are scant, but various late medieval Khazar settlements are mentioned in the Crimea, in the Ukraine, in Hungary, Poland, and Lithuania. Now, I believe that these countries have a large population of Jews, right? All right, so where's the Jewish Khazars? The general picture that emerges from these fragmentary pieces of information is that of a migration of Khazar tribes and communities into those regions of Eastern Europe, mainly Russia and Poland. So if people knew the term Hebrew, meaning one from the other side, and these people were not from there, these Khazars, and they would get there, wouldn't the local people call them Hebrews? Meaning those immigrants, foreigners, immigrants, those from another region? Could be, right? Now it says here, where at the dawn of the modern age, the greatest concentrations of Jews were found. All right, so Russia and Poland. All right, they know the Khazar tribes ended up there, large communities of the Khazar, and that's actually where the largest concentrations of Jews are found in Europe, Russia, and Poland. All right, this has led several historians to conjecture that a substantial part and perhaps the majority of Eastern Jews, the majority, remember the dude said 80% of the DNA, and hence of world Jewry, might be of Khazar and not Semitic origin. All right, the Eastern Jews. All right, and he let us know, remember before, that these are the same people that ended up founding the state of Israel, these Eastern Jews, who are actually might be more Khazar and not Semitic origin. They're not the Hebrews, not Semitic. The far-reaching implications of this hypothesis may explain the great caution exercised by historians in approaching this subject if they do not avoid it altogether. And honestly, I have been avoiding it. Again, disclaimer, right? Fair use. Do what you want with the info. I'm just reading books. Don't kill the messenger. Thus, in the 1973 edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica, the article Khazars is signed by Dunlop, but there's a separate section dealing with the Khazar Jews after the fall of the kingdom, signed by the editors, and written with the obvious intent to avoid upsetting believers in the dogma of the chosen race. Now it says the Turkish-speaking Karaites, a fundamentalist Jewish sect. Alright? Who are these Turkish-speaking Karaites? I'm talking about the ancient ones, not the ones that we believe they are. Alright? Of Crimea, Poland, and elsewhere have affirmed a connection with the Khazars, which is perhaps confirmed by evidence from folklore and anthropology as well as language. There seems to be a considerable amount of evidence attesting to the continued presence in Europe of descendants of the Khazars. How important in quantitative terms is that presence? Alright, so how important, how big of a presence he's saying, right? He's quoting other people here, but then now the author's saying of this article or book saying, so how quantitative, how big is this, how important is this presence of the Caucasian sons of Japhet? Alright, let's go back. So you might not be you might actually be a Khazar, you might not be a Semitic origin, you're not Semitic, alright? So what are you then? Oh, okay, how important? Then that means that that this presence of the sons of Japhet and the tents of Shem, what? Oh, he's going biblical now. Because remember the Bible, right? In the story of the Bible says that the descendants of Japhet will dwell in the tents of Shem and they will serve them. Alright? So, again, how important is in quantitative terms is the presence of the Caucasian sons of Japhet. Caucasian sons of Japhet. Remember the rabbi said, we're Caucasian. Remember, 80% European DNA in the tents of Shem. Alright, remember, they're not Semitic origin. One of the most radical propounders of the hypothesis concerning the Khazar's origin of Jewry is the professor of medieval Jewish history at Tel Aviv University, A.N. Polyak. His book, Khazaria, in Hebrew, was published in 1944 in Tel Aviv, and a second edition in 1951. In his introduction, he writes the facts demand. All right, so source, primary source for them, right? He's a Jewish history professor at Tel Aviv University. He wrote a book, all right, saying a new approach both to the problem of the relations between the Khazar Jewry and other Jewish communities, and to the question of how far we can go in regarding this Khazar Jewry as the nucleus of the large Jewish settlement in Eastern Europe. All right, the descendants of this settlement, those who stayed where they were, those who emigrated to the United States and to other countries, and those who went to Israel, meaning the state of Israel, constitute now the large majority of world Jewry. All right, letting you know this professor in 1944 book he wrote, right, that the Khazar Jewries, or these Jewish Khazars, right, basically either stayed there, all right, emigrated to the United States and other countries, and or went into Israel, and they are the large majority of world Jewry today. All right, they are the nucleus of this Jewish settlement in Europe, the Khazars. He's letting you know, this professor. This was written before the full extent of the Holocaust was known, but that does not alter the fact that the large majority of surviving Jews in the world is of Eastern European, and thus perhaps mainly of Khazar origin. If so, this would mean that their ancestors came not from the Jordan, but from the Volga, okay? Not from Canaan, not from America, but from the Caucasus, once believed to be the cradle of the Aryan race, and that genetically they are more closely related to the Hun. All right, the Hun. We're gonna see these people related to Mongols. That are related to Turks earlier, the Turkish-speaking Karaites. What's going on here? All right, is there a confederacy here? I smell a confederacy. All right, so they're mostly related to the Hun, Uyghur, and Magyar tribes, then to the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're not related. They're not descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Should this turn out to be the case, then the term anti-Semitism would become void of meaning, based on misapprehension shared by both the killers and their victims. The story of the Khazar Empire, as it slowly emerges from the past, begins to look like the most cruel hoax which history has ever perpetrated. All right, so this book has a lot of information and history on the Khazar Empire, the wars they had, the people that were around influencing them, their whole history, how they converted, and where the sources are, what the sources are. He has a lot of footnotes. All right, so he has an appendix part where you can go check the sources. But basically, he points out the main sources of ancient times that state, their conversion and everything. All right, and so we're gonna get into this book a lot when we start dealing with videos that I'm gonna be doing regarding genealogies of the nations. At least try to see if we can try to figure out some of them, see who they descend to, like where did the Greeks come from, where the Romans come from, things like that. And so right now we're dealing with the Khazars, right? And again, this is part 2, the heritage. Just a quick sample again, because we're going to be talking about Mongols and who are the real Mongols, who are the real Russians, and all this stuff, right? It says here Exodus part 5. So we skipped a lot, right? We went all the way to part 5. It says the evidence quoted in the previous pages indicates that contrary to the traditional view held by 19th century historians, the Khazars, after defeat by the Russians, the Russos, the Mongols, in 965, because they got defeated by Genghis Khan, lost their empire, but retained their independence with narrow frontiers in their Judaic faith well into the 13th century. Remember, they converted, so it was a religion to them. They even seem to have reverted to some extent to their eastward wild predatory habits. Barron comments. In general, the reduced Khazar kingdom persevered. It waged more or less effective defense against all foes until the middle of the 13th century, when it fell victim to the great Mongol invasion. So-called Mongol means great, the great empire invasion, set in motion by Genghis Khan. Alright, so they got defeated by Russia, they got invaded by Mongols. We're talking about the same people. Alright, future video, we're going to put all this together. That's why I wanted to get into this. Even then, it resisted stubbornly until the surrender of all its neighbors. Its population was largely absorbed by the Golden Horde. Who's the Golden Horde? Talking about so-called Mongols. We're just talking about the Russian army. Alright, we're going to get into who the Golden Horde really is and where was its main epicenter. Alright, where was its main epicenter? Alright, and what does it have to do with Batu Khan and the Vatican? Where is the Golden Horde capital? Alright, so again, this population of the Khazars was largely absorbed by who? Golden Horde, so-called Mongols, the Russian armies, which had established the center of its empire in Khazar territory. But before and after the Mongol upheaval, the Khazars sent many offshots into the subdued Slavonic lands, helping ultimately to build up the great Jewish centers of the Eastern Europe. Alright, he got the sources for that. So a lot of them had already bounced, the Khazars, before they even got invaded. And they had already had large so-called Jewish centers, because remember, they converted. Alright, and they became the Eastern Jews. Here then we have the cradle of numerically strongest and culturally dominant part of modern Jewry. The offshoots to which Barron refers were indeed branching out long before the destruction of the Khazar state by the Mongols, as the ancient Hebrew nation had started branching into the diaspora long before the destruction of Jerusalem. Ethnically, the Semitic tribes on the waters of the Jordan and the Turco-Khazar tribes on the Volga were of course miles apart, right? They're not the same people. ethnically they're not. They're miles apart. These are different people. But they had at least two important formative factors in common. Each lived at a focal junction where the great trade routes connecting east and west, north and south intersect, a circumstance which predisposed them to become nations of traders, of enterprising travelers, or rootless cosmopolitans. Alright, so these Khazars, that's why you see them into all this little business, right? Running businesses, money, alright? Selling, trading, you see, because they were in the middle of this place. So it's just like in America, you're talking about like Central America, Mesoamerica, that's like in between two, like South America and North America, right? Connects both, right? It says here, as hostile propaganda has unaffectionately labeled them, all right? So rulers, cosmopolitans, right? So, but at the same time, their exclusive religion fostered a tendency to keep to themselves and stick together, to establish their own communities with their own places of worship, schools, residential quarters, and ghettos. Originally self-imposed. They created their own ghettos. They wanted the ghettos in whatever town or country they settled. This rare combination of wanderlust and ghetto mentality. This is old school. They're not talking about what we think is ghetto. They're talking about the old school ghetto from them. That ghetto mentality, reinforced by messianic hopes and chosen race pride. They wanted to be the chosen race. All right, that's what he's saying. Pride. Both ancient Israelites and medieval Khazars shared. All right, so they both were like kind of pleading the same thing. He's saying, even though the latter trace their descent not to Shem but to Japhet. All right, even though they're not even Hebrew, they had the same kind of aspirations and kind of beliefs. Even though they weren't them, they were just practicing the religion, the faith part. All right, so it continues. So we're gonna end it here. I didn't want to make this video too long. Just a little preview of what we're gonna be getting into. All right.